Hello everyone, this is Mr. Jackson, and today we're going to be finishing up our Concept 3 discussion on the endocrine system. We're going to go into more detail for the hormones that you're going to be doing deep dives on, looking into some individual hormones and trying to sell us on their importance. So, hormones function off of negative feedback loops that will ultimately control that we make them in the first place or that we release them to circulate throughout the body. So the target or the effector organ, the one actually in need of a certain hormone, will ultimately provide feedback and inhibit or prevent any further release of hormones once it's communicated that we've had enough, that we've met our goal. Okay, we've got 3 different types of stimuli, 3 ways in which we can trigger endocrine glands to actually make and release their hormones, and we're going to break those down really quickly one by one. This feedback loop diagram should very much look familiar. We had this whenever we had our initial talks about homeostasis in the body and feedback loops, and so hopefully this jogs your memory a little bit, and you can see that this is very much resurfacing in an important way when it comes to your overall body's ability to control and coordinate and maintain balance. The first way that we can stimulate hormones to be released is called humoral stimuli. This is basically, it's the simplest form of endocrine control, and it's simply put, it's just basically high or low levels of ions or nutrients. Okay, so an example is how your parathyroid glands work. There could be an initial stimulus of low calcium levels in your bloodstream. And so your parathyroid glands, you can find those here on the back side of your thyroid. Your parathyroid glands have these receptors that basically pick up on that deficiency of calcium. And what that can do is elicit a response where your parathyroid glands then secrete parathyroid hormone. That parathyroid hormone gets released and will circulate throughout the body. And ultimately what this will cause is an increase in blood calcium because those storage reservoirs of blood calcium will then be targeted or triggered to release that. Okay, so that's a very simple and frankly oversimplified version of this humoral stimuli, but just remember that humoral is referring to ions, those charged particles, and other nutrients. So high or low, and we will elicit a response. You then have neural stimuli. I'll get myself out of the way up here. You then have neural stimuli, which is hormone is going to be released whenever we have neural input, right? So that nervous input can actually elicit a response. An example here is how your sympathetic nervous system, hopefully you can think back and know exactly what we mean whenever we say sympathetic as opposed to parasympathetic. But it stimulates the endocrine in response to stress, right? So this is one easy example. One specific target cell or target area, target gland that could be affected this way is your adrenal gland. So the stimulus would be action potentials that are being sent from your preganglionic sympathetic nerve fibers. Okay, and those innervate the adrenal gland. Whenever that gland receives a signal, it is then going to respond by its adrenal medulla is going to then secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay, and that is ultimately what's going to help heighten your overall sense of activity and alertness to a potential stressor in your environment. Okay, so we can have humoral stimuli. That's with the overall level of ions or nutrients. And then you have neural stimuli, which requires specific nerve innervation. And then finally, you've got hormonal stimuli, which is just basically hormones are released based off of other hormones, right? So one hormone creates another hormone to be released. And in many cases, we can actually see that certain hormones released can cause a whole variety of other hormones to be released. And so this is going to basically promote a rhythm to how hormones can be released, like a step-by-step process where one gland releases a hormone that then causes another gland to release its hormone or hormones, and it continues that way until the initial response or the initial need has ceased. So this could apply to your anterior pituitary gland, right? So you're going to initially have hormones that are secreted by your hypothalamus that are then going to interact with that anterior pituitary gland and signal that it needs to secrete hormones to then stimulate other glands, right? So it will then stimulate hormones that would interact and stimulate the thyroid, the adrenal cortex, your gonads potentially if you are a male. So these are just examples of how one hormone can actually trigger the release of other hormones in a rhythm or a step-by-step process. Now, it's important to remember hormones can only alter the activity of the target cells that specifically have receptors for that hormone. Remember, it always goes back to a lock and key system, right? Remember, I'm just going to release the hormones and they're going to circulate into the bloodstream and throughout the entire body, wherever that bloodstream leads. That does not mean that I'm going to give the same hormone to all of the cells, whether they need them or not. It's simply going to mean that I will give them to all of the cells that have those specific receptors, okay? Now, if there's a cell that can respond in any circumstance, that means that it's going to respond in every circumstance, okay? So this is why sometimes hormones can impact a whole lot of different organ systems all at the same time, and cause, pretty drastic changes in how our body behaves. So the target cell has to have that specific receptor, or that hormone just simply will not bind to it, right? Meaning that it has to have the right lock in order for the key to go in at all, okay? A response in the target cell will ultimately depend on a few things. Overall blood levels, so how much circulating hormone is there. Sometimes it requires a certain threshold in order to actually accept those hormones onto those receptors. You also have the relative number of receptors on a particular cell or for a particular hormone, right? So that's to say that if I only have a few receptors, but I've got all this circulating hormone, that individual cell will only take in a few of those chemical messengers, okay? Because, and cells with more receptors can take in more of that hormone, have a bigger response quicker, okay? And then finally, the overall strength of the binding between the hormone and the receptor, right? So if those receptors allow hormones to bind and they continue to elicit an effect as they're bound, then that can have a stronger effect until that hormone is then released. If it's just sort of like a one and done where binding occurs and then you have like another process inside the cell and then the binding no longer matters, well then that could be a very short-lived response, okay? So not meaning to confuse you in any way, just understand that there are basically these interplays between the hormones and the receptors that can even accept them. And then you have all of these different variables that can change how much of a response we can expect from those hormones. Most target cells have multiple types of receptors for different hormones. They can respond to different hormones. And this can yield hormone interaction in those target cells, because if we simultaneously release two hormones and the cell has two receptors, one for each, then that means both of these hormones can have an effect at the same time, meaning that their effects might interact with each other, okay? Now, we have three different ways that we can think about this, three more key terms. We have the idea of permissiveness, where a hormone can't do its job fully without the permission or presence of another hormone. Okay, so I've given examples for each of these. Your reproductive system hormones can't do their jobs unless the thyroid hormone has stimulated reproductive development, right? So that's where your reproductive hormones can't do their job until the thyroid actually comes in and facilitates. Okay, so that's permissiveness. You have synergism, where more than one hormone produced has the same effect at the target cell. So this creates an overall amplified combined effect, right? So both glucagon and epinephrine are a good example. They both can bind to the receptors on your liver cells and cause the liver to release glucose or blood sugar into the bloodstream. When acting at the same time, they cause the release of way more glucose, right? So this can be a really helpful mechanism whenever we need to have a drastic increase or decrease in some sort of homeostatic level. So we've got permissiveness, where I can't do my job unless you tell me I can. You've got synergism, where, hey, let's work together and create a better effect. And then you have finally antagonism, where one hormone is going to directly oppose the action of another. So for example, this could be like insulin directly opposing glucose and the glucagon that raises your glucose levels, right? So insulin is in direct conflict with glucagon, and so that means that if both of those are circulating, that they will, in effect, battle it out and fight for those receptors that ultimately control your blood glucose or your blood sugar levels. Okay, so permissiveness, synergism, antagonism, this is how we can have more than one hormone interacting and changing the overall effect. And then we want to finish really quickly with our overall chemical structure. Ultimately, this is anatomy and physiology, guys. Anatomy is structure, physiology is function. Form dictates function. I've said it over and over and over again. It's a key variable in the study of anatomy and physiology. And then we want to look at this idea that the chemical structure ultimately is going to determine how it behaves. And namely, we're going to look at it's determining its solubility, or how it's able to be dissolved in water or not. Okay. This can also affect how it would be transported throughout the bloodstream, how long it will last in the bloodstream before it degrades and is no longer useful, and then what kind of receptors it can be received by. Okay, so the structure of these hormones really dictates all of the useful components of their function. You have two main types. We've got the ones that are amino acid or protein, those little building blocks of protein. Amino acid based, which are water soluble, meaning they will dissolve in water. This applies to all of your water soluble hormones except for thyroid. And then you have steroids, which are lipid or fat soluble. Okay, that applies more to those lipid bilayer membranes. But most hormones are actually going to be water soluble, meaning that they can readily be degraded in the bloodstream, which is a great thing if we realize that we have enough of what we need and we no longer want it just circulating and continuing to have an effect. Good thing that it can degrade and dissolve in your bloodstream and then be, processed out by your kidneys. Gave you this table here. This just provides a really useful comparison of what happens with these fat-soluble compared with our water-soluble hormones. Okay. Remember the lipid-solubles, if we go down the list here, this is all your steroid hormones and thyroid. These are going to be the hormones that come from your adrenal cortex, your gonads, and your thyroid gland. Because they are fat soluble, not water soluble, we don't have to put them in those little vesicles, those protective packages. Blood transport, in order for them to circulate, they require plasma proteins that they can actually latch onto. Their half-life in blood is long because they won't dissolve readily in just our fluid environment within our bloodstream. The receptor location is usually intracellular. They're lipid soluble, meaning that they can readily pass through those cell membranes and into the cell, where they can then have their effect on those internal receptors. And their action is that they specifically will target genes, and that will create new protein to be synthesized within those cells, and those proteins will ultimately respond to whatever homeostatic imbalance is there. On the other side, we have water-soluble hormones. These are all amino acid-based hormones except for thyroid, jumped over. This is just basically all of your other endocrine glands function this way. This is most of the hormones in your body. We do, because they are water-soluble, we do have to package them in those neat containers that can help get them to where they need to go. So they are in vesicles. Blood transport, they can usually just flow through the blood freely. They don't require any sort of shuttle or transport. Their half-life in blood, being that they are water soluble, being that they're just freely floating around, relatively short. They're going to get to where they need to be, and those that don't, as that effect is taking place, will just simply be degraded and processed out. They will typically only have their effect on a receptor on the plasma membrane. So this is how most hormones work, with those receptors on the membrane of all the cells that they interact with. And this is going to trigger what we call second messengers, which basically the receptor communicates internally that, hey, I've got this hormone, we're good to go, let's start this process, and this will start a pathway within the cell. Never required my hormone to actually go in, only to talk to the receptors. And finally, you got just what I hope will be a little helpful visual for this comparison. Whenever it comes to lipid-soluble, remember, I got my hormone here, the receptor is internal, I can cross through that lipid barrier into and bind to that receptor. That receptor will then talk to our nucleus, or that DNA, that genetic informational component, in some way, and then I can create new proteins based off of what's needed. Water-soluble, those are going to specifically remain outside and bind to our receptors, and these act as the first messengers that will trigger some sort of a response inside of the cell, which can then be used by some sort of like a second messenger in that chain, and then we can do the same thing, which is to cause a cellular response. Okay, so a lot of information in this second part, definitely useful as you frame what hormones are and why they're so variable and why so many different glands have such different effects. We are not in any way, shape, or form going to create an exhaustive list of all the hormones and try to really compare and contrast their relative functions, but we will give you an opportunity to do a deep dive on some of these hormones that are of most interest. And so that's what we'll head into, and we'll see you at the next video.